And for those of you who are being introduced to AvePoint for the first time, AvePoint is the largest independent software vendor of SaaS solutions that migrate, manage, and protect data in Microsoft 365. Our webinar today will cover 4 ways how AvePoint can secure your customers' collaboration systems and drive value. So before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping topics. So today's webinar is being recorded. We will share a link with every one of you after the webinar is completed. Please feel free to revisit the content yourself and share it with your colleagues. And you do also have the opportunity to send questions through the chat box at any time. We'll collect all of these questions and we'll address them during the Q&A section at the end of today's presentation. Okay, so here's the agenda for the webinar today. We've got some great stuff to cover. Firstly, we're going to explain common gaps in collaboration system deployments, how to bundle and package collaboration security services and solutions to meet customer needs, create effective selling motions for new and existing customers, project the increased economic opportunity for your business generated by collaboration security services and solutions, how to order AvePoint, special promos, and finally the Q&A section. Okay, so today we do have 2 speakers, Elliot Cito, who is the Channel Solutions Engineer at AvePoint Australia, and myself, Daniel Matthias, and I am the AvePoint BDM here at Ingram Micro Australia. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Elliot.
Great, thanks, Dan. Appreciate that intro. When we're talking about secure collaboration, everyone, we really need to understand what that is about, what we're referring to as part of that. So as we go through this, we're going to help you understand what we refer to as secure collaboration, particularly when we focus around the Microsoft 365 suite, right? And how potentially we can provide additional solutions and services on top of that to make the customer's environment more secure. All right, particularly how they're collaborating through, specific things like Teams and SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. Right. So we need to understand firstly what is considered sensitive information, right, or confidential information in some cases. So that really comes down to, the level of acceptable risk that the client particularly has, right? So you're going to have different levels depending on verticals, depending on the client themselves, right? As an example, legal, education, health are going to have a lot of requirements around particularly sensitive information around, legal documents, around case studies, around caseworker information or personal data, PII. Financial services are going to obviously be focusing around that financial data. So it's about going through and understanding what is particularly sensitive or particularly confidential to that specific client. Right, understanding and being able to go through each one of those points and then being able to analyze them on a regular basis so that we can understand how that poses a potential risk to the organization, right? And identifying that risk is a big part of obviously understanding and putting that structure in place to make sure we're maintaining the security around that sensitivity and ensuring that we're not collaborating in a manner that is opening up potential risk or data leakage to the organization as well. Right. So generally, we're not as protected as we think. There are a lot of tools out there. Microsoft do a pretty good job themselves into providing certain security level layers and services within their environment as well. But we need to also be able to understand that and basically bring all that information out and try to put it into an order that makes sense at the end of the day. So we need to, how we do that is by helping you understand potential exposure, right? And minimizing the potential loss around that exposure, right? Through how people are sharing, particularly what are they sharing, right? Through those key functions that we mentioned before around Teams and SharePoint, all right? So as part of that, are you exposed, right? In many cases, they probably are. If you're sharing with external parties, right? If you're working with external guests within Teams or SharePoint, right? there is a level of exposure there that we may not completely understand. And while that is part and parcel with collaboration itself, we need to understand if we're correctly doing that within that environment, right? So if that specific guest user has the appropriate permissions for that particular team, and they should actually have access to potential content within that team or SharePoint site. Or that could be exposure within the client itself, where there's certain levels of information that shouldn't be crossed over between departmental lines, such as financial information shouldn't be accessible to the warehousing staff, as an example, or however you want to sort of branch that out. So those type of things could identify exposure and potential risk of things like data leakage. Right. So we need to understand who can access that information, right, and when they've accessed it as well, so that we can use that as part of an audit trail. Right. But when we look at the risk of the data loss, right, how does that impact as well through collaboration? Well, if I'm sharing information, right, that's one thing. But data loss can also be impactful from a disaster recovery situation, right? A lot of you are probably already familiar with cloud backup solutions, even local backup solutions as well for appliances, desktops, and things like that. Right, so do you understand that? Sorry. So as part of that, we obviously, as part of prevention against data loss, it is effectively your insurance policy, your safety net, right? So if all else fails, all those layers of security that you might implement will come back and allow us to restore that data against things like ransomware attacks, against things like a disaster situation where we need to do that full recovery, right? So in many cases, while you are probably familiar with the SLAs, many of your clients are probably not familiar with that, right? So we'll go through some talking points around how you can navigate that conversation and help raise awareness with your clients as well around, what they're being covered for through their service providers like your Google, right, or your Microsoft 365 environments and things like that, right? So one of the challenges that we're effectively addressing around this is understanding the potential risk around that data leakage, right? We understand that data is growing, right? So when we look at that from a security perspective, there is a lot of risk that is identified as part of that is primarily unintentional, right? And that comes down to things like data incidents due to user errors or human errors, right? Where the cost of to a small organization, which is probably the bulk of the people joining the call today, where your sort of key sort of target market is in that SMB space. So the cost of those can be obviously quite impactful to a smaller organization, whereas it's going to be less impactful to a large organization because they can generally wear that cost across employees, where a small business or small or medium business can't. Right. So we need to understand what that risk is and being able to sort of close those gaps as part of that security conversation and that data risk perspective to prevent against these things like data breaches and particularly data leakages, which is effectively that user-driven error, right, where they've shared something that they shouldn't have. So we need to be able to sort of bring that in line, and we can increase that by up to 95% through some sort of security automation, right? Again, Microsoft have tools to do that, but that's where we can layer over some of our additional tool set to provide you a lot more granularity and access into that. So when we focus in on collaboration security, right, there are 4 different ways that we look at that and approach that from a Microsoft 365 point of view. Right. The first step is around access monitoring and control, and I'll go through each one of these steps individually as well in a bit more granular manner. But when we look at access control, it's about understanding the risk in there, right? But then also being able to put controls into place, which you might do today through provisioning and PowerShell scripting and all that sort of stuff to effectively maintain that security posture within the organization, right? Maybe making sure that MFA is kept in check and enforced, or looking for external guests and making sure they only have access to specific workstations, right? But that can be quite clunky and time consuming natively through Microsoft. So this is where we can use our policies insights, which allows you to layer over the top of that, which introduces a lot of time savings, where we will go through and aggregate a lot of that risk data for you, help you understand within Microsoft 365 what the customer needs to focus on, right? And then being able to lay the policies, automated policies over top of that so that we can enforce a lot of those items so that if someone does turn off MFA, we're going through and identifying that as a potential violation and overcoming those type of issues by reverting that back into an in compliant state. Right, and then obviously backup, disaster, and recovery. Right, we talked through this and that's obviously preventing against potential insider threats or things like ransomware attacks or whatever the case may be. And effectively, again, that's your insurance policy, right? And that starts to give you that holistic approach where you're covering both the security and prevention of that risk, and also the insurance, right, to make sure that if all else fails, you have something to recover back into. But then we look into additional provisioning and management, and this is focused around, SharePoint, Exchange, and a few other items in there, where we can start to automate some of those day-to-day tasks by adding on additional items on top of things like what we do in policies and insights to give you a broader view into managing that environment, and particularly using this as the ability to restructure a SharePoint environment as well, maintain some of the sensitivity policies and things like that, and being able to sort of automate a lot of those tasks, right? And last but not least is around migration, right? And you may be thinking that generally comes first, and you're right, right? But in this particular scenario, we can then encompass those first three items while we can use our Fly migration tool to effectively allow us to then do a full restructure of a site as part of that. So we can start to use the migration tool to automate a lot of that function, right? Do some discovery around potential unidentified or dark data where it holds no business relevance, and use Fly to come over the top of that and basically create this whole new platform, right? Where the customer can work off to allow us to better secure their environments by removing some of that dark data and also putting some additional controls into place with all those three previous items as part of that. Right? So when we start looking into that, right, we're going to focus on access monitoring control first. This is really around understanding again the risk, right? And then when we look at our CEO, Dr. Tian Yi Zhang, or TJ as we call him for short, he references that proper security should enable collaboration, not restrict it. Right. That's one of the reasons why Microsoft really opened it up within that modern workspace. They want to make simplify things across the board. Right. But there was an issue that came along with that, whereas, by making that really easy for users to collaborate, it potentially opened up some additional problems where we now need to go through and understand that risk. And there's a number of ways we need to go through and do that and natively. Is basically going through and understanding each one of those individual reports that are available to us, right? Such as the permissions report to understand who's got access to where. Right, identifying potential external guests who might have access to a particular workspace, and trying to understand whether they should have access to that or not. Right, then aggregating that against the audit data, right, so that we can understand that activity. So while they have permissions, have they done anything with it? Have they gone through and viewed a particular file, or maybe something malicious where they started to delete content which they shouldn't be doing, right, which could create a compliance issue? Or potentially they've started to go through and download that client list because they're about to leave the company and go to a competitor. So that's the type of information we want to sort of bring down and help you understand in a much easier manner, right? So that we can create that story in that context. But the last piece of that puzzle is understanding, is that information sensitive in nature? Is that confidential? And we can use the DLP function within Microsoft to basically aggregate all that information and bring it down into a nice, neat story and context so that we can understand the true risk within Microsoft 365 for those clients. All right. So as part of that, we can then overlay that with effective automated policies and actual insights into that so that we can start to put controls into place. So again, we can identify violations as we set up per best practices and revert any of those changes as part of that as well. Right, so those individual service centers now become one because we're bringing all those data into it. We've now decentralized all those audit logs, right, which would generally happen in E3, right, where and through Microsoft natively, we don't actually get those actionable intel until we sort of get jump up into an E5 and use the insider threats as part of that. And then through the DLP, right, we don't generally get a lot of that information until we get that indexing through E3, right? And then maybe automated labeling through MIP as part of that E5 licensing as well, right? So that really, most SMBs don't necessarily have that level of licensing, right? Or many that I've seen don't, right? So this allows you to obviously override some of that by being able to provide this same level of security insights and services into a business basic license as an example, right? So you don't no longer need to require that E3 or E5 for a lot of those specific concepts, right? So how we do that is again going through and bringing all that information in. So as an example, if we had that permissions report through Microsoft, we could see that Roy is an external guest and he's got access to a particular team, right? We can also see that Roy has potentially accessed a document within a team 10 times in the last month. And we know that the team contains sensitive information through our DLP report, right? So as we go through, we can now sort of condense that down in a nice streamlined manner and save you a lot of time and potentially hours worth of time sifting through those logs so that we can easily go through and understand in a few clicks of the mouse that Roy is an external user, has access to confidential info, and we can see these activity through the past month or months. Right. We can then go through the next step where we're automatically going through and removing Roy's access to that particular sensitive team through our automated policies because it's discovered that that team should not have any external guests attached to that. So we're going to remove and strip Roy's access. We're also going to go through and notify Sarah, who is the admin for that particular team, to let her know that we reverted that change and also let her know why we did that as well. Right. It is an out of policy situation based on the compliance requirements or regulatory requirements that we've implemented as part of our best practice policies, automated policies that were created. So as you can see with a lot of this, right, you can do manually, but policy insights is going to save you a lot of time, right? And when I give you an indication of time, purely going through and pulling down the DLP reports, the permission report, and the audit reports, speaking to partners, we've come to a conclusion that on average, it could save you about an hour per client, right? If you're going to manually go through those items to help identify, build that story and understand that context, because we're going through and finding and prioritizing all of that information for you, aggregating all that data, but also giving you the ability to structure it in a high, medium, and low risk categories, right? So we're taking it a step further so that you can clearly define what is high risk to the end client, right? So that your teams or even the client can focus in those high risk items first and work their way back. Right. We're then going to give them the ability, right, the client or even yourselves, the ability to go through not just monitor, but fix any of those exposed hotspots by being able to go through and revert any of those potential permissions that are opened up, prevent against things like shadow IT, right, or even identify any anonymous links that might be shared as well, and reverting any of those, unsharing, or at least going through and putting an expiration date on that. And then this also allows us to identify any of those insider threats where we can go through and do a full audit against a user who's about to leave the company and understand what he's got access to and his activities over a period of time. Right. But that last piece is probably the most important, where we're then overlaying that enforcement, right, for security prevention. So we're preventing against those insider threats before it becomes an ongoing issue, where we're stopping that in its tracks, right? Identifying those security risks over time so that we can harden or soften our approaches as needed. And we can do that at a individual workspace level, right? So that we can navigate around unique requirements in the environment themselves, right? So different departments may need their own policies being built or locations, depending on what country you're situated in. Or we can sort of harden an approach for a specific set of users, like your executive team within or leadership team within that organization, so that we can build out additional hardened policies around that. Right. So that will allow you to give you a lot of benefits into what that looks like, and allows you to start taking control over not just the security, but the governance perspective as well, right? Which is the governance framework is really about taking control on who's got the ability to maybe create teams or SharePoint sites or even delete SharePoint sites or add and modify content within a given SharePoint site as well. And we'll be able to start to navigate those governance type conversations at an entry level basis, right? Or a foundational basis, so that we can start to build on that and apply that to those SMB clients who may not have the budget to really adopt some of those more advanced governance type solutions out there in the market. All right. Oops, it went back. Oh, no. So as we go through, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll answer it toward the end. When we move into the second lot, right? Again, this is really around insurance, around backup, disaster recovery, right? And our CEO, Dr. TJ, basically says, if don't ask if it's backed up, ask if you can restore it, right? Because there's at the end of the day, if you can back up through a number of different means, right? But what's the purpose of a backup if you can't restore it back into its original location, or be able to restore it into a manner that suits the business, right? So that's where we can potentially leverage by not just backing up the content, but having granular restore options around that, right? But when we talk about selling that and helping the customer understand the potential risk and why they might need a cloud backup solution, it really comes down to understanding what Microsoft or your Google provider, or whatever the case may be, is actually providing with the SLAs at that particular time. So when we look at this, right, Forrester actually pulled out a good article several years ago, which helps break down that barrier, helps break down those lines, and clearly defines what Microsoft provide as part of their offering, as part of their SLAs within Microsoft 365. Right, and what they stipulate there is that we will cover off, things like loss of service due to hardware or infrastructure failure, or loss of service due to natural disasters, or a data center outage. Right, we're also going to cover things like short-term user errors, right, with the ability to retrieve that through versioning history, or things like recycling bin, right, with simple file restores, right, or short-term administrative errors through some of that soft delete or restore functions that we have through the backend rollback function. But that's not going to cater to long-term storage, right? Where from a compliance perspective, particularly in ANZ, we need to go through and retain some of that data for 7 years, right? And also prevent against data, short-term data loss through deactivated accounts, where we no longer need to pay for an account, but we still want to retain some of that data, right? So converting to that to a shared mailbox, maybe just restoring any of that backed up data through the backup solution as well, right? Preventing against things like malicious insider threats or hacktivists, or simple things like ransomware attacks, right? Or prolonged recovery from prolonged outages. So if Microsoft 365 goes down, we still need a way to get into it. As long as you got access to your backup, you still have the ability to go into that and effectively export that, and that will allow us that additional redundancy that we might be requiring as part of that backup solution as well. Okay. So a lot of those common issues are not due to disaster recovery, it's actually due to user-driven errors, right? So things like a user going through and misplacing a document, or deleting a document, or maybe deleting an email, right? Or something that just might have been corrupted because they didn't save properly, or whatever the case may be. Right. So we need the ability to go through and effectively recover a lot of that, right? Some of those could be those admin-driven errors that we mentioned before. Maybe someone's broken their inheritance or removed permissions from a SharePoint site. Those are the type of things that we potentially need to be able to restore. Right, so that no longer becomes a problem, and those are things that you can't necessarily do easily through Microsoft themselves. Right, so those are the type of things that we can potentially inject and provide as part of our cloud backup solution, where we can easily go through and roll back all those individual granular changes as part of that. Right. Protecting against ransomware is obviously a big one, right? When we look at the risk of ransomware today, right? 485% of companies have, ransomware attacks has increased compared from 2019 into 2020, and that's on track to have a similar sort of number between 2020 and 2021, right? For that page. When we look at how many businesses have been impacted, right, it's a staggering amount there. Over 55% of companies have suggested, right, with fewer than 100 employees, that they have been impacted by some sort of ransomware attack in the past. When 75% of attacks were in companies that were making less than 50 million, right? So that key SMB type vertical or customer size that most of you are probably already working in, right? So that's where we obviously want to increase our protection around, cloud backup and things like that. When we look at things like average cost of ransomware downtime, right, that can be dramatic, and particularly for an SMB type client that has to wear that cost, right? 178K, and this is in USD as an average of payment demands back to get that data back if needed, right? And to 20 billion in total ransomware payments has been projected by cyber criminals by the end of 2020, right? And that met its target. It was actually a little bit higher than that. So when you look at those figures, those are substantial. And if we can, potentially minimize a lot of that financial risk by being able to put things like cloud backup, obviously that helps us protect it a little bit more, right? So when you look at your cloud backup, right, or your backup provider, right, does that take into account all of those things that we sort of went through? Does that provide that additional redundancy, right? Does that allow you to take that offsite storage, locate that somewhere else, have the ability to easily go through and test, and make sure that we have not just the ability to back that up, but restore that information as well, right? So when you look at all that, there is minimally good, which a lot of vendors out there do, right? But then there's very good, where we're taking that additional copy and allowing it additional granular access into all of that information, and allow you to sort of recover from instances like a full ransomware attack, right? So when we look at other additional information, can we also recover that if there is a complete outage and if the corporate network is offline, right? So those are the things when you want to sort of take into effect, right? This is where our cloud backup solution can really help, right? And we have a number of different options for that. So Microsoft 365 is probably our biggest solution there, but we do cover off things like Salesforce, Dynamics 365, and Google Workspaces now as well, right? When we look at cloud backup by AvePoint, right, we're doing that automated backup, right, which is going to include things like 4 times daily incremental backups as on top of that full backup scan that we do initially. Have that automated, so that's going through and doing that 6 times per day. And through our included Azure storage, we're going through and maintaining that storage and having unlimited detention for the entirety of that account. So no matter if you're doing that for 1 year, 10 years, or 20 years, we're going to keep all that data on your behalf, right? But particularly important is having the ability to have that delegated access and also granular restore, right? So being able to potentially with, particularly for smaller MSPs, where you might need a self-service option so that you can give the power back to the end users, maybe powered end users, so they can do their own restores, right? Maybe restores on behalf of the organization for other users or other SharePoint sites, right? But being able to do that in a granular manner so that we can get down to, for mailboxes, not just the entire mailbox, but we can go through and look for a specific mailbox item, such as a specific email version of an email. We can also, be able to restore things like calendar items or tasks or anything under that as well. Or for a SharePoint perspective, we might want to be able to go through and not just restore the complete site library, right? We might want to go through and be able to restore the apps themselves, or down at the document level where we can go through and again restore the specific document, but also retain any of that metadata, that underlying metadata that's contributed to it, as well as being able to restore those permissions as well, right? So to maintain that security layer where we're, again, looking at collaboration security, we're not potentially opening up our security impacts by opening up who's got access to those particular documents, files, or lists and libraries as well. So we're maintaining all that security permissions as part of our restore. right? But having full visibility and control so that we can look at potentially, overprotected content and be able to go through and remove that as well, or using things like GDPR, which is prevalent in the EU, where we see a lot of regulators using that today, locally, where they need to have the ability to go through and discover PII data for specific users and have the ability to delete that content from their backups as well. Right. So when we look at that from a broad perspective, right, we're doing a lot of that things through Microsoft 365, such as Exchange, including things like in-place archive mailboxes and shared mailboxes, Microsoft in Teams, including private channels, which some of our competitors don't do today. All right. Then you got the full groups, SharePoint, OneDrive, even public folders. We also support things like Project and Planner as well. And again, having the ability not just to restore that content, but the security as well will obviously maintain that collaboration security that we're referring to. Okay. So when we move into the third piece of the puzzle as part of this, right, cloud management, right, is what we assign with that. And again, referring to what Dr. TJ, our CEO, mentioned, right, in services for managed service providers, time is literally money. Right. So when we look at that, we want to be able to go through certain types of events and be able to go through and maintain some of those policies and automating a lot of those structures. Right. So an example here is we have Peter, who's a army officer. He's ended his tour of duty, right, and left the army. But John is the new army officer that's taking over that role. So what we need to be able to do is go through and make sure that Bob, the IT admin, has the ability to easily go through and effectively copy and paste the same security access that Peter formerly had, right, and provide that to John. So John has access to all the same sort of content and data and locations that Peter had prior to him leaving. Right. So the problem with that natively is it's not easily go through and do and manually copy over a lot of those permissions, right? And potentially do that at the object level individually, right? It's generally done at the content or container level, right, or the folder level, where it could potentially open up some additional security risks. Right. So that can be entirely very time consuming to obviously go through that. So we want to help you streamline that and be able to go through and easily clone those user permissions across that, right? By using Cloud Manager to effectively save you a bit of time. And we can just say, right, everything that Peter had before, let's just apply that to John, right? And that can be done within seconds, right? So as part of those user permissions, you can keep that all in check. Right. But we also want to go through and manage administrative tasks, right? Those day to day. And while Policy and Insights has the ability to manage some of this, it doesn't give us full access into a lot of these items that is popping up on screen, right? Being able to go through and navigate around specific administration tasks within SharePoint, as an example, within Exchange and a few other items as well. So where we see a lot of clients actually spending their time is going through this management, the SaaS management, and going through and navigating and doing that repeatedly across a particular a set of time or cadence, right? Whether that is every 3 months or monthly as part of that regular cadence. So we want to be able to help you save a lot of time, and we've through couple of case studies we've done, partners of ours have managed to save about 70% of that time spending that they've spent compared to native versus using our cloud management solution, right? Where we can do and automate a lot of that function and streamline a lot of those administrative tasks. Right. So within that, that's going to obviously go through and allow you to do those bulk configurations from a centralized portal. It's also going to allow easily quick search capabilities so that you can go through, identify, edit, and manage particular users, documents, objects, right, or site libraries as part of that, and any permissions that might be associated with that as well. Right. And then we can sort of create a lot of those ongoing automated tasks that it just goes through and regularly looks at those things so that we can easily go through and do things like clone those permissions or provide granular delegation to specific users so that they can go through and assign their own task and manage their own environments as well. Okay. And again, in the last but not least, is that Fly and a tool we use for migration, right? And that, again, can be one of the first things you do, or it can be used as part of this collaboration security, right? And again, TJ has mentioned within services, time is money. right? So the problem we have is being able to understand the types of information that lives in your source environment. So when we look at that from a broader perspective, there's a lot of data that potentially sits in there. So when we understand that data, right, there's a lot of those specific items that are day-to-day things that we utilize, right, such as project files or reference documents that we're constantly logging into and utilizing on a regular basis. It could be those longer-term things that we still need to keep, right, client records, employee records that are used, less frequently than those than that top level. But there's a lot of this dark data or dead data that's sometimes referred to, which is a lot of irrelevant information that's sitting below that surface when we look at this iceberg analogy, right? So in many cases, a lot of that dark data is the stuff that we potentially need to get rid of, right? So as part of a migration, right? Maybe you're coming from a on-prem environment into the cloud, or maybe a third-party solution like Google Workspaces into Microsoft 365, right? We need to be able to understand what lives in that source environment, right? So by being able to go through and navigate that, and what we call a discovery report that allows you to do a little bit more investigation into what lives in there, so that we can do that discovery of that dark data, right? And that dark data might be things like information that's older than 7 years that is no longer relevant to the business, right? So for compliance reason, we potentially no longer need to keep that. Maybe push that into our archiving solution as part of long-term storage, right? It could be things as a file server that a user is using for their own private repository and saving their own private data in there as well, right? Or things like, and this is a lot more common than I like to admit, but that file server again, where users are using that file server to store TV shows and movies and things like that, which obviously holds no specific relevance to the business. So as part of that migration phase, we can use that to, obviously clean that up and take that different approach away from those lift and shift migrations to the approach where we can add additional value, where we can do that additional discovery, and then as part of our automated processes, maintain or sanitize that environment so that we're cleaning that up as part of that project. All right. But when it refers to things like collaboration security, we can also use this as one of the last additional steps, where once we've identified all that potential risk, we can also use the fly migration tool to do a lot of that cleanup internally, right? To make it a lot easier to shift files around and re-engineer the folder and file structure to put that in line with new security policies. As that client starts to grow and scale, they might have to create additional departments which have to have their own security policies, maybe have additional locations where we need to go through and put additional sensitivity labeling around that to maintain a lot of that confidential data, right? So that allows us the ability to go through and clean that up in a much more structured fashion, so that we can now look at all that data and start to put them in a specific order that makes sense to the business moving forward. That'll save us obviously a lot of time in terms of trying to rework all that manually, but also allow us to, again, being able to enforce and classify and tag a lot of that sensitive data and implement additional security functionality that might be tricky if we've still got all that particular dark or dead data sitting in there that we need to skim through, right? If we can remove that, and that might even be, half the data that's sitting in that file server, that'll allow us to streamline and obviously focus in on what's important to the business so that we can maintain a lot of those security classifications and components as well. Right. So that's where our Fly solution comes in, so that we can easily go through and do that fast and full service around data transfers. And there's a couple of things around our unique agent architecture that allows us distributed workload and navigate around things like Microsoft 365 throttling limits as well. Right. But we can also maintain a lot of that data integrity, not just by going through and migrating that over, but maintaining the permissions and security elements like we do through our backup, and also that underlying metadata as well, right, on top of that. Right, and being able to do that securely with heightened security controls through encryption and making sure that is all maintained both at rest as well as in transit as part of that migration as well. Okay, so when we piece all of that together, right, it starts to now put different layers of items that we can start to centrally manage a lot of those security provision around Microsoft 365 and really provide additional value, right? So as we move to traditional managed services, we're stepping away from those transactional things, which is just migration, which we generally do for the once, and we can now bring that into as part of our managed services, where we can implement backup as part of that, which many of you are already talking about. But then obviously implement things like ongoing management and policies and insights, where we can identify risks and maintain a lot of those security policies as well. Okay. So when we have a look at a comparison, and particularly with migration, on how you can benefit, if you are using Microsoft's native functionality today to do a lot of the migrations, right? Generally, there's a lot of man hours that are attributed to that. So if we use that first line, right? So a 50 user migration as an example, right? So you have your user fee, you have your total hours, which is 60 hours worth of manual labor that one of your technicians or your project manager would need to take, right? So that will give you roughly about a 20% profit line, right, with your margins. If you can automate a lot of that and use and reduce the amount of manual labor through those automated tasks, which we can through to with AvePoint's Fly solution, you can still charge the same, but your profit margin then wholly increases, right? Where we can start to increase our margin by reducing that labor, which obviously gives us a much higher profitability overall, right? So obviously that's more money in your pockets. That's more time in your team's calendar as well, where they can spend more time on additional projects or other tools that or workloads that they might need to spend their time on. Right. So when we look at bundling a lot of that together, right, we can start to include a lot of that, right, where we can add those licensing and gross margin and those overall costs, not just through migrations, but other services that we might provide as well. So we're starting to, see some of that, net margin around migrations in this particular case, which is -90, right? To start having a more positive impact on our net margin there, where we can start to really drive a profitable environment, right? And increase that over time through those additional options, right? Allows us additional scalability, and obviously as we grow as a managed service provider, AvePoint will help grow with you. Right. So when we have all those in line, it starts at that elements, right? And our elements is our multi-tenant user management or client management portal, right? So this is designed to obviously be one single pane of glass to go through and manage all your clients throughout those different services that you might you might provide. And this is something that we're spending a lot of time investing in through our strategy, particularly now that we are a public company, and SMB through our partner base like yourselves is such a big part of that, right? Um, so when we go through and connect the dots, right, we want to start, looking at security collaboration through all those elements, through Microsoft Teams, bringing all these 4 elements together so that we can start to provide a lot of that security to you and start to expand our services catalog, right, where we can start to bring in Pi for additional access monitoring and security monitoring. We can start focusing on obviously data loss protection or adding that as part of our holistic approach, right, and allowing you more additional granularity, particularly with restores and the ability to go through and provide, end user restores as part of that as well. Right, being able to streamline our provisioning and management across things like SharePoint specifically, where we can go through and copy those user permissions across in a much easier fashion than Microsoft provide natively today. Right, and then obviously secure migration through things like Fly. Right. When we look at that selling motion, right, it becomes a really easy thing to approach, where we're, not just talking about individual products now. We're talking about a whole offering where we're combining this as a full subset of a security collaboration SKU, right, from an MSP perspective, so that we can, not just drive this is what the product does, but we can look at that as say these are this is the solution we're providing, and these are the services that we're going to bring with it. Right. So it doesn't need to be catered to a specific product type topic. right? It's obviously going to provide customers with the ability to identify their security easily, easily go through and pull out management reports, and again, having the ability and to do that self-service restore, right? So that you can take that on as a couple different options within your managed services, where you can say, hey, Mr. End Client, we're gonna provide this as a fully managed services where our support teams will come in and cater to every need. Or we can do a hybrid type model where you have the ability, if you want, for your own IT admin to take control of some of these elements so that we can give them granular or security trimmed access so they have access to only a subset of different areas within, things like backup and being able to restore just specific types of content, but not everything, right? So that gives you a lot of flexibility, and obviously having the ability to sort of migrate a lot of that data as well, right? So when we finalize that, right, a lot of the things that we provide is basically starting with our partner program, right? And I'm going to hand things over to Dan here in a sec, but this partner program will give you access to a lot of additional access to training around our solutions for both sales and technical tracks. It's obviously going to give you access to additional deal reg environments, being able to go through and work with us directly as part of a co-sell function, all the user guides throughout all of our solutions, as well as, most importantly, go-to-market materials. So presentation decks, go-to-market collateral, white label data sheets that you can use to easily go out to your users, your clients, and start to sell straight away, right? Because we have designed all of that, a lot of that stuff for you, and we are going through and designing more to make it much easier for you as a managed service provider to go to market without the having to do a lot more through marketing organizations or having your own marketing person who might not have the time to do it today, right? So with that, I'm going to hand back to Daniel to go over some additional items.
Great, thanks, Elliot. Thanks for that presentation there. So now I'm going to quickly walk you through how to order AvePoint, more specifically the collaboration security solution that Elliot was presenting earlier there. Okay, so to get to the Ingram Cloud Marketplace, simply search for au.cloud.im, or obviously within your respective region, it'll be a different URL there. And obviously bookmark this address here because obviously that's where you'll be able to procure all the AvePoint licenses through our portal. And to start ordering the licenses, log in with your CMP account as indicated there. So obviously after logging in, you'll be taken to the Ingram Cloud Marketplace, and to search for that collaboration security solution, search for the collaboration security bundle, as you can see here. If you don't know the specific solution that you're after, you can search for AvePoint itself, and it will populate with all the AvePoint solutions available to you through your Ingram Cloud portal there. As you can see, I have selected the collaboration security bundle for MSPs, and it is the promotional SKU here. More information on that later. And I'll add this to the cart and proceed to the through the order process here. As you can see, this promo SKU has a minimum requirement of 50 seats. And if you wish to add more seats, simply hit the plus icon there. Your cost price is $5.55 per user per month. And that's obviously with the promotional discount there. And obviously to proceed to the next step, hit the next button there. Now you will need to select the customer to order the licenses for. And if this order is for a new customer, simply click on the Add New Customer button there and complete the customer's details. But in this example, I created a test account to proceed with the order here. Hit Next to continue. Now, this is the most important section of the order process. There are two important fields that you will need to complete here. So for the top field there, obviously you can see we do require the customer's M365 email address there, preferably the customer's global admin email address, for the M365 tenancy. And for the bottom field, please make sure you enter an internal email address where you wish to send the welcome email to. And obviously, if any of the email addresses here are incorrect, the licenses will not provision. So make sure you check that the email addresses are correct. And finally, this is the last step of the order process. It is a fairly straight order process through Ingram Micro. So you can review your order here, check if you've ordered the right licenses, if you have selected the right customer and whatnot. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and make sure you agree to the T&Cs. It won't allow you to complete the order if you don't, and hit buy to order the licenses. The licenses will provision within 15 to 30 minutes with your login details to the AvePoint Elements portal. And yeah, obviously you'll receive the welcome email within this time frame as well. And that essentially wraps up the order process. It is fairly straightforward. If you do have any questions or need any help with the order process, feel free to reach out to me or your respective rep within your region there. Okay, so we do have some special promotions running for AvePoint, and it is lasting until the end of December 2021. As you would have seen, I was ordering the promotional SKU, obviously through the demo there. So for every Ingram partner, we're excited to offer a special 25% upfront discount for any of the promotional SKUs, including the collaboration security bundle, as you would have seen earlier, or for any of the SKUs below for backup for Dynamics 365, Salesforce, or Google Workspace. So this promotion does end on December 31st, 2021. So I advise every one of you to get in quick to take advantage of this offer. So if you wish to connect with your AvePoint team, so obviously Elliot Cedar was presented in this webinar here. Feel free to save his contact details. He'll be able to help you out from, I guess, like a pre-sales perspective there, technical and sales. And you also have access to Danny Ferguson as well. She's the distribution manager here in AvePoint Australia. And she can help you with the partner program, partnering up with AvePoint, things like that. Obviously, I am from Ingram Cloud Australia. If you do need a local representative or need local assistance, with procuring AvePoint or need any assistance with the marketplace there, feel free to reach out to myself or even Christy, our vendor manager for AvePoint, and we'll be able to support you there. I'll give you guys a second to save our contact details. Otherwise, we will send the slide deck at the end of the webinar.
Yeah, just to add to that, I see there's a few potentially Singapore partners or partners in the Greater Asia region. We do have a contact, AvePoint, basically distribution manager out there in Singapore as well that covers that region. Of course, as Michael has dropped into the chat, you can reach out to Michael Wong or Kimberly Ko. They have Freddie's details as well, so they can always reach out to Freddie if needed, if you need additional support from the AvePoint side of the business.
Good stuff. Thanks, Elliot. Okay, so just going into the Q&A section, I think we have a few questions in the chat box there. So just to quickly answer one of the questions there from one of the attendees, we will be sharing the presentation after the webinar when it's ready, and we'll also provide you with the webinar recording as well. Just quickly check in the chat box as well. Seems like we don't have many questions. It seems like everyone understands AvePoint, and seems like Elliot did a brilliant job with presenting the AvePoint solution. But I do have some questions for you, Elliot. So how does AvePoint stack up against its competitors, more specifically, with the policies and insights, cloud backup, and the migration SKU?
Yeah, thanks, mate. Good question there. So it really stems from us traditionally coming from the enterprise side of the industry, right? AvePoint's been around for 20 plus years in the enterprise space, where we've a lot of those solutions that we went through is providing a lot more granularity than some of our channel-specific vendors out there or competitors out there that provide. And that's really getting down into the nitty-gritty around, we focus in on, do you have the ability to restore, but how granular can you restore as well? right? So I'm not going to name specific names, but having the ability to also back up things like private Teams channels, maybe list and list items, in-place archive mailboxes might be a requirement for some of your clients, but also having the ability to restore that data at that granular level as well, so that we can look for that mailbox item, even around the security permissions that's incorporated, right? When we look at something like migration, again, stepping away from that lift and shift migration we talked about, but being able to drive additional value, because as a managed service provider, that's effectively what we're doing, right? We shouldn't be just going in there and saying, oh, we're just going to move your house, right? And when you use that analogy, the last thing you want to do is move house, but take everything with you, include all of that rubbish. So why not use this as a potential to get rid of all that rubbish that might be sitting in our environment, and use that to move over to a nice, neat and clean environment? That's going to make our lives as the MSP and the client lives a lot easier in the future, where we can start to go through and have a nice, clean, secure environment as part of our redistribution of that data that we had. Right. When we look at something like policy insights, right, there is effectively no competitor out there in the market today, right? We are one of the first ones or only ones that currently do something like this. But a lot of that, who we effectively compare with, right, is Microsoft themselves, right? But it's not a compete per se, because again, a lot of the concepts that I went through are stuff you can do within Microsoft, but it takes time. And from my experience, time that a lot of technicians, MSPs, don't have on a standard day right now. So trying to incorporate additional hours worth of lookups across the multiple different clients to identify risk within Microsoft 365 is just something that's not palatable for them today, right? In many cases, why they don't offer that type of service today, right? So that's potentially where we can sort of step in.
Awesome. Good stuff, Elliot. I got another question for you. What does deployment look like, and is it super simple to set up for a non-technical person?
It is. You will need some key information. So, Fly, as the example, is a hybrid solution, so it needs to be deployed somewhere. But you can do that on a any sort of resource, a Windows 10 PC or a server or Azure VM. Right. But it is quite simple to deploy. The wizard will take you through every step and tell you what you need to do, as long as you meet some minimum specs. For backup, right, effectively, we've got a couple different modes, and it really depends on the granularity that you want to provide to the client. But our express mode, you can have the backup started running within 15 minutes, right? So that onboarding is quite lightweight. Right. The backup itself might take time, depending obviously on the size of the client, right? And that goes the same for things like policies, insights, and cloud manager, where you can spin it up, and it's really up to you, and it will depend on the granularity that you want to implement, on how much time it will take to onboard. But from a basic perspective, again, you could get those particular solutions up and running within 15 minutes.
Awesome. And just conscious of time, I've got one more question for you. I've seen a lot of backup solutions in the market, and some say they do more than 10 backups a day, but is a lot less than they promise. How many times does AvePoint backup a day?
Yeah, we can guarantee four backups per day, right? And looking at that example that you gave, Dan, a lot of the wording is up to 10 times a day, right? So they don't guarantee a specific number. So that might depend on how much data is flowing through, right? How many retention points they have is basically automated as part of the system itself. Whereas we can go through and automate throughout all those different workloads individually, whether it's Exchange, Teams, SharePoint. We can set that up so that we can do 4 times per day, right? So that you have additional restore points, again, to be able to go back to specific versions of emails or documents as part of that, to do that granular level of retention and restore.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elliot. I think that about wraps up the questions for the day. Just want to thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar. We really appreciate your time. And thanks again to Elliot. Great presentation. And thanks again for sharing your insight and expertise. Quick reminder again, the promos are live and active and available in your marketplace today. So feel free, if you have any questions at all, start transacting the licenses through the portal. feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'll be able to support you. Thanks again for your time, everyone, and catch you again soon.
Thanks all.